There we go.
Of course. So I guess maybe to repeat just for the audience, since you're just starting to record now, I wanted to debate Kane on moral realism, but I'm not 100% sold on my position. Actually, I'm not even that keen on it emotionally. It just seems to be something I rationally reached. And of course, having a STEM background, maybe that's what led me there. I think this is going to be nice. So first off, I think the first question that I'm curious about, and I think is relevant for this debate, is: are you a metaphysical anti-realist?
What?
So that's a position that objects in the world are not mind independent. So metaphysical anti-realists deny that the world is mind independent.
Yeah, in some sense I am. But I tend, in the context of like talking about metaethics, to sort of bracket that, and just because I think it's one of those things where, like, you know, whenever you engage in philosophical debates, it's sort of easy to just kind of undermine the whole debate by like rejecting a load of the premises, and then it just seems less interesting in a way, you know. So it's like there is some sense in which I think I would be a metaphysical anti-realist, as you've defined it. I have to be a little bit careful how I frame that, though, because what I would want to say is that you know, so I think that what objects there are sort of dependent on our means of classification. I don't think that means of classification are like given by the world. I think that we construct them. Would that mean that they're not mind independent? Well, obviously our best models of the world do in fact draw a distinction between mind and not mind, right? So in that sense, like from within the model, there are certainly mind independent objects. But I again, like I don't know if that's just going to completely undermine the whole debate, then we can bracket it. You know.
No, I actually think it might, because so how would a moral naturalist ever be able to overcome somebody that's, I mean, I can't convince somebody that's a metaphysical anti-realist, or can I, if I'm a moral naturalist?
Right, so I think that you might be able to, because okay, there are lots of things that, you know, there are lots of objects and processes and properties that I'm going to say, yeah, like I believe in that stuff. So if you say to me, you know, well, there are pleasures and pains, yeah, of course there are pleasures and pains. If you say, like, there are people, there are societies, there are particular things that societies can do to promote the flourishing of their members. You know, there are particular types of rules that if everybody were to follow them, that would like promote peace and cooperation. Like, yes, right. Now, of course, I can kind of step back from that, and then I can say, all right, so these, you know, these like distinctions, when I'm sort of drawing distinctions between, you know, pleasures and pains, and, you know, the way that I sort of carve up reality, that's like I'm going to take at least an anti-realist line on that, you know, on sort of classification and kinds. I mean, maybe one way to put it is I don't think there are natural kinds, but I mean, obviously, I'm like, it's not as though I'm unable to talk about stuff. Obviously, I do. I have lots of beliefs about the way the world is. It's just that I will adopt a kind of relativist or constructivist account of them. But that, I don't see why that would matter, because I mean that I still have beliefs about the way the world is, and presumably that I still share at least some of them with you.
Okay. So I think, yeah, so this was just an introductory question, let's say. I'm really not that hung up on it, but I was just wondering. So maybe I can describe my kind of moral naturalist I've reached, starting from saying, so we humans are biological organisms, I would say. And as biological organisms, limited finite biological organisms, we're subject to some laws. So, for instance, we can't see in 4 dimensions, and we can't see the full spectrum of colors. And it seems to me too that even our thoughts are governed by some laws in some sense, because, for example, we can't think of something, we can't picture something that is both A and not A. So, and I think this is to be expected for any kind of biological organisms, that they would be kind of guided by some rules. And so, taking this line, I would say, for instance, we even have some beliefs that are instilled in us from the fact that we are humans. For example, I would say, for instance, that we believe that we ought to follow the law of non-contradiction when we speak. Maybe you can say, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe
I don't believe that. And I sorry, let me clarify. I literally don't believe that we ought to follow the law of non-contradiction. I also would say that, so, I mean, there are some people who, this maybe is a problem for that specific example, right? So, I get the general point that you're making. With respect to that specific example, though, and this maybe does pose a problem for the general point, because, you know, there's a long history of, like, philosophers pointing to things that they think are just kind of like, you know, analytic, a priori, you know, we just, like, it's kind of built into the way that we conceive of the world, you know. So one thing that's built into us is this law of non-contradiction. And then it turns out, actually, there's loads of philosophers who've just straight up denied it. I mean, you know, I think actually in the recent Phil Papers survey, 12% endorsed true contradictions, right? So I mean, like, that's actually quite a lot. That's a significant number of people just coming out and saying, like, yeah, I think there are true contradictions. And honestly, you know, dialetheism is the view that there are true contradictions.
Yeah,
seems pretty plausible to me. Now, but the more general point, though, is even if I, like, bracket that and I say, okay, let's just assume classical logic, and let's assume that, like, everybody accepts classical logic, so everybody denies that there are true contradictions.
you're already granting a lot of things to me.
Sorry?
You're already granting a lot of things to me. You already granted 2 things. Okay,
yeah,
go on.
But this is kind of, so this is the important point, is that I don't think that there are epistemic oughts, or, like, you know, like, logical oughts. So when you say, well, like, you ought to follow the law of non-contradiction, well, you know, that's always going to have reference to like, people's desires and goals, if I'm making an ought claim. So I can say, you know, we're both engaging in inquiry. I assume that we want to have, you know, true beliefs, and we want to minimize false beliefs. And so then I can say, well, you know, like, maybe in that sense, you know, you ought to, you ought to follow these logical rules. But if you're just sort of, like, giving that as, like, yeah, without reference to people's desires and goals, then yeah, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't really know what that means.
Okay, so maybe I can try to. So first, let's say we weed out all the self-referential cases. So, for instance, I can maybe grant something back and say I can accept the Deleteus view that when we are talking about self-referential statements, and in some specific cases, then we don't have a necessary belief to follow the law of non-contradiction. So maybe I can grant that, and then it seems to me that so maybe I should be a bit more precise when I talk. So I think there's a law that governs us that makes it so we necessarily believe that we ought to follow the law of non-contradiction. But this doesn't mean it governs us perfectly. So, for instance, we can choose to not follow it. So we can choose to behave as if we did not value the law of non-contradiction. But there would still remain this force inside of us. For instance, if I started just saying a bunch of contradictions right now, after a while, I think I would feel compelled to start speaking normally again. It seems like these are some guiding forces behind us as humans, as pertain to us, the humans. I don't know if that's going to be of any help right now, but maybe I've.
Yeah, so I think that I mean, one of the reasons why I said like I can just bracket the dialetheism thing is because I think where the real disagreement here is on this idea, just the notion that there are particular logical rules that like we ought to follow, or I guess kind of general epistemic norms, which I just don't accept. So
it's not that we ought to follow them. Like we believe we ought to follow them.
Yeah, but I don't believe that. So, I mean, so it's like you're saying, well, you know, there's this kind of law that's making humans believe that, but I've never. So when I think about logic, right, I would say, you know, I can say that, okay, here's an argument, and the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, right? So it's logically valid. Or maybe I can say that, you know, this has a logically valid form. But then I mean, I wouldn't just say like, oh, well, you know, so if you accept the premises, you ought to accept the conclusion, or anything like that. At least not without reference to specific desires and goals.
Maybe let me try another example. So, for example, I would say another one of these laws is that we necessarily believe that beliefs should be based on evidence.
Yeah, I don't believe that.
Yeah, you don't believe it either. But I just. So
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult here.
No. I fully appreciate.
Any of those shoulds and oughts, right? Like I don't believe that. So
it just seems I struggle to believe you in a sense because so okay, maybe let's say subconsciously. So how I don't understand, how can you operate if you don't believe that beliefs should be based on evidence? Of course, like when you wake up in the morning, you believe that everything you like, all the objects, like when you have to brush your teeth, you know that things are going to be there. You believe that you have a bunch of inductive evidence. You're waking up every single morning, and these objects are always in the same place, and they don't kind of change through time. And you kind of subconsciously or unconsciously believe that. I mean, at least it seems to me that beliefs should be based on evidence.
Okay. So this is another thing we're going to have. I don't think that I don't accept that there are any like inductive rules, but again, I bracket that point. So the point I'm making is, look, I want my beliefs to be based on evidence, right? I want to have true beliefs, and I want to avoid false beliefs. And it seems to me that the way to do that is to, you know, let's say, apportion my beliefs to the evidence. Okay. So yeah, that's what kind of governs my representation of the world. But I don't think of it in terms of like, well, beliefs should be based on evidence, where this is somehow a kind of categorical norm, where this like norm holds independently of your goals and desires. You know, whenever I use a claim like ought or should, right, that's always, I think it's always just going to come down to, well, you know, this is a particular means of satisfying certain goals and desires. So it's always just going to come down to these, it's like means end relationships. So like, does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I change so let me try the last attempt down this route. Maybe then I'll say something else. So if I changed, we necessarily believe, we necessarily desire to hold beliefs that are based on evidence, would you be more inclined to accept that? So we necessarily desire to follow the law of non-contradiction or something like that.
we necessarily desire to follow.
Hmm.
You mean like so? I guess I would have to, given that I said I'm willing to just bracket concerns about dialetheism. I think that that means
Yeah, yeah.
that
So let
everybody
me.
does.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let me be more specific. So I necessarily desire to follow the law of non-contradiction in the non-referential um, domains, let's say.
Yeah,
So
we do actually have to bracket this stuff because there are some people who are well. For instance, I have a friend who's a trivialist who believes that that all propositions are true, and so that also entails that all propositions are false. Um,
okay.
so he believes in like universal contradiction everywhere, um, and it sounds kind of crazy, but surprising how difficult it is to refute that position. Um,
Well,
so
moral naturalism seems kind of crazy to me too. Just you can go on.
uh,
So,
yeah, you know, like I, if for the purposes of this discussion we're just like ignoring people like that, then yes, it's going to be the case that everybody wants to avoid non-contradiction.
okay, but so even a person like that, I would kind of want to push back a bit and say that subconsciously he must be reaching his views by using the law of non-contradiction. I don't know how. So maybe this is not a conscious thing. So maybe when you self-reflect, maybe these laws are not exactly conscious. But so when you self-reflect, you can say, okay, I don't really give a fuck about these laws. Um, what do you think about that? This kind of subconscious aspect of of the laws.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to like do with that. I just, I mean, like, I mean, it's you can always kind of postulate these sorts of subconscious processes, but like, what am I supposed to say? It's kind of like when I'm, you know, sometimes like I have a conversation with somebody, and they might just say, "Oh, you know, you're lying," or like you're not being honest about your position, and I just think,
Yeah, it's
well, I
true.
mean, okay, like, I mean, you can believe that, that's fine, but then I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information. I mean, I feel like the conversation just has nowhere to go. So,
Yeah,
um,
no, I wouldn't say you're
I
lying or
don't
your
know
friend
how
is
to.
lying.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying I wouldn't say that you are lying or your friend is lying.
No,
Actually, I don't
I'm
believe that
using
in the
that as an
slightest.
analogy.
Yeah.
Sorry, I
Okay.
know that
Hmm.
you weren't accusing me of lying, but
Yeah.
to me, it feels like the same kind of thing because what can I do other than say, well, sure, like maybe. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any reason to think that that there are these. There's like a what would it be? You know, subconscious desire to follow the law of non-contradiction. That that doesn't seem that plausible to me. But I don't know. Maybe I.
Okay. So
Yeah.
let me flip this maybe in a sense. So it would seem very weird, maybe to misuse a philosophical term, a bit queer, if we humans weren't governed by by any laws in this sense, by any subconscious laws in this sense. It would just kind of strike me as a kind of human exceptionalism that we are kind of free of thinking whatever we want, about acting subconsciously. However, about yeah, we're not guided in any way by nature, like basically all the other organisms I can see in the empirical world. Um, so
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I'm fine with the idea there's like, you know, let's say law governed processes going on in the brain. But I like if we're now trying to specify what exactly those are, um, I don't see any reason to expect that it's going to be something like a subconscious desire not to believe contradictions. Um, So it's just a
so
specific example, really, maybe. But if the general point is just well, you know, there are like yeah, say there are brain processes happening that I'm not aware of that are influencing. Well, I mean that seems to be definitely true. Yeah,
so for example, so if I brought up the fact that cognitive dissonance seems to be a thing that we experience and which it kind of makes us pause. So one way of interpreting cognitive dissonance, and you're not going to agree with this, so maybe it's that we have these necessary, maybe let's say unconscious laws that govern us, and when we do hold contradictory beliefs, they manifest in the fact that they're compelling us to try to resolve this contradiction.
Yeah, I agree.
So
That's a way of interpreting it. Yeah.
Okay.
But I imagine there are probably other ways of interpreting it. So
yeah.
I think actually as well, like you mentioned this point about human exceptionalism, but it is the case that in biology the law is variation, right? Like that's the big thing. So I mean again, this isn't really maybe that relevant to the point, but I would expect that any sort of subconscious law or whatever, or law that you can point to that's influencing people, the initial expectation I would have for that is, well, actually it's not really a law. There's going to be exceptions to it, because that seems to be the case with pretty much everything in biology.
No. Oh yeah. I would. So I think that's a good point. But I think you made a bunch of good points up until now. But I think that's another good point. And so maybe I would have to add another qualifier and say, I don't know, healthy humans. So I can conceive of cases where, because there is biological variation, and sometimes this biological variation is very strong. So in the case of maybe somebody that's born, I don't know, without a brain or with some problems in the natural architecture that builds us as humans. I could grant that in those cases, maybe these processes wouldn't take hold. So I would maybe say that if I would like to say these processes are universal to humans. So with universality, I would mean maybe healthy humans. If this makes sense.
Okay.
To you.
Yeah.
Okay, but we still haven't agreed that these things exist. So if we want to move on from this point, you're going to have to grant me this again. Or otherwise we can keep on kind of talking about it a bit. So it seems to me you're kind of inclined to agree that these kinds of things do exist, but the examples that I'm giving to you are not really representative of what these things would be.
Well, I don't know. I think is my position. I think I would just be agnostic about this. It seems to me that there's a lot we don't really understand about the brain and subconscious processes and all of that at the moment. What you've suggested there is one plausible interpretation of what's going on, but there are probably lots of others. I think that it seems as a general point that so let's put it this way: there are processes going on in the brain that are going to influence my sort of conscious experiences and beliefs, those processes that are subconscious that I'm not aware of, and then these are going to exhibit certain law-like regularities when we look at humans in general. I agree with that. So I don't know, maybe that's enough, right? Like we have a sort of foundation there, and then if you want to say, well, look, here's one plausible example of this. Okay, I mean, we can just go with that and see where it goes. So the desire to there's a subconscious desire not to believe contradictions. All right, let's accept it and see where that goes.
I would first of all say that I would absolutely agree with you that I'm just kind of postulating things that I think are plausible in a sense, but I'm not dogmatically saying these things exist for sure. Of course, it just seems to me. So these seemings bring me to a kind of view about morality. So let's say we let's say we kind of don't really agree, but we have some of this foundation. We can you can basically grant it to me a bit. So from this, I would say that when we have specified the laws of classical logic or the laws of statistics, these are attempts by us to formalize these laws that govern us. So what do I mean by this? I mean that a whole enterprise, when we have these rules of classical logic, that are thought of some kind of, in a way, they're thought of special with respect to other kinds of logic. I think that the reason why they're thought of special is because they're mapping on to this cognitive architecture, these subconscious laws we have. And in the same way, for instance, the theory of hypothesis tested in statistics is mapping on to our pattern recognition abilities. So another process I would say we are kind of subconsciously guided by is that if we see evidence of something, we are brought to beliefs. So, for example, if I see somebody flip a coin 1,000 times and it always comes up head, I am necessarily compelled to believe that that coin is fake. So if I see him, there's something in me that that tells me that I believe I ought to believe that the coin is a rigged coin. Okay, so maybe I stop here because I talked for a while.
Yeah, okay. Again, you use that term "ought" in that last sentence, and I'm not sure I'm gonna. I think that's probably where I'm gonna have some problems. But yeah, okay. So
sorry. Let me revert back to, let's say, I desire.
Yeah.
How would I reformulate this in terms of desires? So, or maybe I would say that in this case, I just have a belief. I'm subconsciously brought to the belief that the coin is rigged. But can I defend? So I would kind of say it is an ought, because if somebody else were to in front of me were to see this process and he would say, "Oh no, the coin isn't rigged," I don't think it would only be a belief. Because I would be kind of looking at him and saying, "What's wrong with you? Like, you ought to believe what I just did, given the evidence you've just been subjected to."
Yeah, I might say the same kind of thing, but again, it's with reference to my desire to, believe true things and not believe false things, and then I'm just making an assumption that, like, I'm kind of just projecting that to other people, right, and assuming that we're all engaging in this sort of projective inquiry. So yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay. So let me map all these kind of oughts to desires. I think I was thinking about this in my spare time because I actually thought about the criticism you're giving, and I think it has some merit. So I think that maybe desires can do. So of course, at a certain point, I'm going to offer a reformist definition of morality. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's say you would kind of partially agree that the classical logic and, for example, the theory of hypothesis testing is kind of mapping onto these subconscious processes we have. Then, and here is where I would introduce the moral domain. So we've talked about the logical domain, the inferential domain, and I will talk about the moral domain. And I would say, for instance, that one of these subconscious processes that guides us in the moral domain is that it would be a belief that my unnecessary suffering is bad. So what would you say about that?
Okay. Yeah, we can build whatever we want into the subconscious architecture.
Okay.
So
yeah. Okay. So you're being very kind to me. So okay. Okay, so I would say so. One of these kind of principles we are necessarily compelled to obey is that all of us believe that our personal unnecessary suffering is bad, and so at this point, what I think our normative theories are doing is what our logical and statistical theories are doing. They're trying to map on to these processes, these architecture that we have because we're organisms, and so in this sense, we kind of obtain a morality that we obtain the mind independence. So we can say that moral statements are true if they correspond to these processes that govern us.
Right. Okay. So let's say that I do have all of this subconscious architecture. Let's say that
Yeah.
I have subconsciously the desire to avoid non-contradiction. All right, but I don't have that consciously. That's not what I don't desire to avoid non-contradiction consciously. So why should I care that that's what's going on subconsciously? Similarly, if if we say, well, there's this like subconscious desire to avoid unnecessary suffering, but like maybe I don't believe that consciously. Okay, why would I? I mean, so here's the thing, like. It seems to me that sure we could come up with some theory that like matches these subconscious that kind of matches or corresponds to in some sense this subconscious architecture, and like
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could kind of moralize that system. You could say, well, that's then telling us what we ought to do. But like I could come up with some other system which instead matches my conscious beliefs and desires, right? And like now I have a different normative. If I moralize that system, I've got a different normative system. So, like,
Yeah,
why should I just follow that one instead?
I completely agree with what you just said. So basically, I would say that my reformist definition does a good job at representing what we mean when we talk about moral statements. So you could do what you're saying, but I think that when we, I think that, yeah, I just think that my reformist definition maybe captures what we mean when we utter moral statements is that you're doing something bad, but it's not because of some conscious. So your conscious framework would be subjective, while my framework, for instance, would be objective in a sense because it holds for every healthy human. So
Why does
your
that make a difference?
well, no, it just counts towards the fact that this reformist definition kind of captures better than what we probably mean because we have these processes inside all of us than your definition that you proposed just as a counterexample right there.
I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean when you say like it captures what we mean, because it's not capturing what I mean, right? Like if because when I'm talking, like I use, you know, if I don't believe, like if I don't have the conscious desire to avoid non-contradiction, for instance, and it's not like again, that wouldn't be that unusual. There are lots of people who seem to who similarly seem to not have that desire. Like, how is it? In what sense is it capturing what I mean? Like, it doesn't seem to be. It seems like, unless you're saying that like meanings are somehow tied to subconscious processes, but that doesn't seem very plausible.
I see what you're getting at because of course there has to be some way that the subconscious bleeds into the conscious. I don't know. I think you make a good point. but I'm not sure it doesn't capture though. It just that what I'm saying is that what we necessarily believe we ought to do is what we ought to do. And I'm defining ought in terms of what we necessarily believe we ought to do. And it seems like these things should exist due to the fact that we are biological organisms that are governed by some laws. So, of course, the subconscious must bleed into the conscious somewhat, because when you say you don't believe you don't believe you ought to follow the law of non-contradiction, but in your everyday life you do. For example, in this conversation, we have been following it all along, because we're okay. So maybe here I'm putting you off.
We could have a different conversation where I wouldn't be following it. Depends on the domain.
But in that conversation, we would be acting as if I don't think we would be acting. We would just be pretending to not value the law of non-contradiction. So if we started to talk in gibberish right now, me and you, we would be going against.
I don't think it would necessarily be gibberish. I think you could point to things that I mean, again, like maybe this doesn't matter. I'm kind of willing to just bracket this, because I think the more important point is like, look, actually there are two big points.
Okay.
So I suppose so. One is I just don't care. I don't care what's going on, like, subconsciously. That's not how I'm using moral language, and I don't think other people should. I could not care less about if I have like some subconscious desire to say avoid the non-contradiction or to minimize suffering. Well, so what? If I don't have the conscious desire, then I couldn't care less. And it seems like morality is something I should care about. So that's one point. And then the other point, though, is I think, look, I mean, I've been willing to kind of grant that there's this subconscious architecture, and I'm willing to grant that there are sort of very kind of general, very kind of vague things we can say about it. So it might be the case that there is a desire to avoid non-contradiction or a desire to avoid unnecessary suffering. I don't think that's going to do much to get you like moral, to get you any kind of moral system. So you could like we could just kind of grant that, like, all right, well, maybe it's like a fact that unnecessary suffering is bad, but then that's going to be compatible with a huge range of like different moral theories.
No.
So,
of course,
I don't think it really gets you very much.
Okay, so let me answer let me try to answer your first point. So initially, when I thought about this, I wasn't thinking really subconsciously. So I granted this subconscious element that maybe I shouldn't have, because I think they, at least if they're subconscious, they actively bleed into the conscious in some way. And to your second point instead, so I was reading a bit about desires, and apparently there are some philosophical theses that say that normative beliefs are desires. So that normative beliefs equals desires. So we're actually using the same word for two different things. But even let's say I accept that these are only desires. Desires, if I'm not mistaken, they're usually defined as appearances of goodness. So in terms of appearances of goodness. So first of all, would you agree with? I don't know. I'm going to appeal to your knowledge right now. Would you agree?
I don't know. I don't have like a theory of desire. I would just use it to mean like something I want.
Okay. So the definition I saw about the definition, it wasn't really a definition. It was somebody trying to in a paper trying to explain what desires meant, or why desires motivated us, is that they gave us this kind of appearance of goodness. And I think I would be willing to work with just desires as appearances of goodness. So I think I've been putting you off because I've been using ought. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why I've been putting you off, but one of them is because I've been using ought, I think. So maybe if we just and I'm kind of I'm kind of unwilling to departure from these oughts because I've just in my mind I think a bit that way, but we should just maybe we should just move to appearances of goodness.
Okay, I don't know if that's going to help because I don't think of desires as appearances of goodness, and one of the reasons why is that if we're talking about goodness, we're talking about something that's kind of mysterious to me. I mean, that's one reason why I'm an anti-realist, right? So I think I kind of know what desires are, and I mean, maybe I don't have a theory of them. I don't have a theory of desire, but there are lots of ways I can just sort of, I mean, I could just do it ostensively, right? Like if somebody asks me, well, what is a desire? I can just kind of sort of point to particular types of behavior or particular types of mental state to help answer that question. When we talk about so desire seems to be, this just sort of useful folk psychological category that I think I have a good grasp of. I don't really know what an appearance of goodness is. So like if I desire a chocolate cake, I mean, is there an appearance of goodness? The problem is that when I think about goodness, I'd be inclined to understand that in terms of, I'd be like, well, something can be like good for somebody in the sense that, they desire it, right? So it wouldn't really be helpful to say that the chocolate cake has an appearance of goodness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So a chocolate cake, when you desire a chocolate cake, it doesn't have an appearance of goodness, you would say.
Well, maybe it does. I mean, I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, so I'm not sure either. Actually, no, yeah. Okay, so maybe to go forward, let's just say desires without. Let's just say we have these subconscious processes that you grant to me that they bleed into the conscious, that they're just desires. So we have a desire to hold beliefs that are based on evidence. We have a desire to follow the law of non-contradiction. We have a desire to not suffer, let's say. Then I would, so for our desires regarding suffering, for instance, and I would say that our normative theories are trying to map onto these. So maybe let me just open another way of thinking about this. So it seems very strange to me that our normative theories are not mapping onto anything that is descriptively human. So, for example, we don't come up with normative theories that say like what is good is green, so we should maximize the amount of green in the world. Or we don't come up with normative theories that say we should torture children. So when we are developing these normative theories, it seems very intuitive to me that they're mapping onto something that must be descriptively human, because otherwise we could, otherwise why aren't we never talking about, normative theories that maximize greenness, as I was saying before?
Okay, so yeah, I agree that that moral theories almost certainly do that. If we sort of understand this in terms of like there are, well, I mean, so certainly there's going to be kind of correlations between, in some sense, between like normative theories and processes going on in humans, and there's going to be important causal relations there. Maybe one way to put this problem is, look, it seems to me that like nobody really thinks that whatever the way we happen to think, or maybe like the way that we have evolved to think is like thereby good. So it like just in itself. So like we also have lots of cognitive biases, and I can come up with some theory of, like, let's take the epistemic case, right? I could come up with some theory of belief formation which maps onto our cognitive biases. So, you know, I could, like, I don't know, what would be an example? Like, why can't I think of an example of a
No, I get
cognitive bias?
what you're trying to
Yeah,
say.
but I
No,
want to
but
give an example, and you know, I mean, like, there are probabilistic errors that people always make. You know how some people they do that thing where, like, if you they think that if you say that, like, Lindsay is a bank teller, and then you say you give more information. You're like, Lindsay is a bank teller,
oh yeah,
and she's a famous,
yeah.
and then people say, oh yeah, that's more probable, even though there's more information, right? So
No, that's less. That's less. Oh yeah, that's more probably
yeah,
exactly.
so
Yeah,
they'll say that the one where that you've given more information is more probable.
yeah.
So, like, I could come up with some theory which which says that that's what you ought to do, right? So, like, when you get more information in certain contexts about certain things, then you ought to conclude that it's more probable, and that would map onto the way that humans have, for some reason, we have been, we have evolved, like, our cognitive architecture has evolved in this way. I mean, I guess this is what I was kind of getting at when I
Yeah.
was like, look, you can give a moral theory that maps onto these subconscious beliefs, but I don't care about that. And honestly, I don't think that I don't think most people care about that. Like, I think that the reforming definition you're giving is just not going to latch on to what people actually care about, which seems like it would be a problem for a
Okay.
for a reforming definition of morality.
Okay. So let me go into depth a bit. So when you're saying this thing about, for instance, these statistical biases we have, a part of me thinks that you're kind of making my point for me, because we have developed this theory of statistics that, in my view, of course, is mapping onto some descriptive process we have as beings that can do pattern recognition. So we're good at doing pattern recognition. So we're mapping onto this process, and the reason we call these other things biases. So, for example, I think biases would exist even in the moral domain. So if we would go along my enterprise, these first principles would be the one that would construct the theory, and what would be out of these first principles, let's not call them subconscious process anymore, because of course I don't know exactly what these, I was trying to give an account of what these could be, but I don't know. It just seems very plausible to me, and you agree with me that they're kind of something of descriptively embodied in us as humans. And so in the statistical domain, we call some things biases because they exit the correct way in which to do pattern recognition. And we have axiomized statistics in a way that we see when we diverge from the intrinsic natural ways in which we do pattern recognition. And so in that sense, it seems to me...
Wait a minute. Why wouldn't a cognitive bias just be one of the intrinsic natural ways in which we do pattern recognition?
Yeah, well, I would bring as evidence the theories of classical logic and statistics for this. We have a way to recognize, and I can't really explain what it is, but we have a way to map onto deeply held natural laws that govern us, the rules that govern us. And this is why we come up with theories like logic, and maybe we have logical biases and statistical biases, is because these biases are not representative of how we are naturally necessarily compelled to believe. Maybe
that seems... Sorry, but isn't it kind of I mean, like, obviously classical logic and, formal statistical theories, I mean, these developed only in the last, couple of 100 years. And they don't seem very natural. Like, sometimes, when you try to teach people logic, right, there are certain sort of... So I can, remember the confusion in the classrooms when people were learning about the material conditional in classical logic, because it behaves in such like weird ways. And like similarly, when you learn about some of these errors that people make with probability, like even people who are actually trained in these subjects, will quite often make the same errors. So it seems like those, you know, it seems like they're quite sort of natural ways of thinking, whereas the formal theories that we've created are often not so natural. Even though we might think that well, we should trust those rather than our intuitive processes.
But there is a sense when after this is explained, after these theories are explained to you, you naturally accept that they are saying something that's correct. So you kind of descriptively like have this moment where you say, that actually is something I deeply bond with on, and maybe this is just me being a STEM lord, but maybe they seem to map onto some things we believe to be truer than the cognitive biases. So maybe cognitive biases arise because we are finite beings and we don't have this infinite processing power. So we can't always abide by the optimal. We can't always abide optimally by these rules we have that are due to the fact that we are natural organisms. So we develop these biases because we have a limited processing power, and then when we formalize the rules that govern us in the inferential and logical sense, we intuitively see that they are actually what matters, and these biases are due to something else.
Okay. Right. I mean, I mean, obviously, I agree that like people can be brought to agree that like certain ways of thinking about probability, like a truth tracking, and certain other ones are not. But maybe a way to ask this is like, do you think? I mean, it feels like there's a very strong claim here being made, which is something along the lines of, in some sense, right, like these formal theories of classical logic and statistics and so on, like we've somehow evolved with them, whereas the cognitive biases, which seem to be much more like manifest in people's everyday behavior and everyday ways of thinking, those are in some sense deviations. But like, even if I was to accept that, like, I mean, I don't know. Do you think it's possible that we could have evolved differently?
Yes. Yes, right. I would grant that, yes.
So we could have evolved such that, what we're calling a cognitive bias. So the bias that in certain contexts, when somebody gets more information, they conclude that it's more probable. It could have been the case that that was part of our subconscious architecture.
So I'm not so sure in the example you gave, because I think creatures that evolve like that would quite quickly die off.
Why? I mean, humans consciously make those inferences, and they haven't died off. We've done quite well.
Yeah, but so what you would be saying in my framework is that basically so these processes that guide us, these rules we have to follow as organisms. So basically, I'm putting at the center of these rules the theory of classical logic and statistics, and you're saying, well, there could be we could put some other theory, and that another theory that guides us, but this other theory, it wouldn't. If you substitute the cognitive biases with a theory, it seems like that would spell a disaster, because we wouldn't have the ability to recognize that what we're doing is not in our evolutionary self-interests. That's how I would put it. So I would say these theories give us the ability to recognize that there's some optimal way to draw inferences, and that's important for evolutionary reasons. So your example kind of, so I'm struggling to accept your example
I have to say,
from this.
I'm not really following so the point I'm making is just like, I'm just wondering if you think that it's so. Look, I mean, human beings consciously, right, make inferences that we would call cognitive biases, right? And I mean, they haven't died out as a result of consciously making those inferences. So, like, I don't see why that those sorts of inferences shouldn't be part of the subconscious architecture. Um,
No, but
and
I would
I'm
agree
not
that
saying that like the subconscious architecture would have like classical logic and formal statistical theories, and I mean I don't think it does have that anyway. But no, I'm just wondering if you think it's like do you think it's possible? That well that yeah, like human beings evolved to have what I suppose is like to just not have like some sort of formal theory, but instead have just kind of sets of like I don't know, rough and ready sort of rules that often go wrong by our standards. Like, yeah,
yeah. So no, okay, yeah, I see what you're getting at. Honestly, I don't know. So a part of me is not sure if a self-reflecting being, like, part of me is not sure if. So there could be a universe where every being that kind of gains consciousness has to abide by some laws that are similar to ours. So they talk about rationality. So their rationality would be similar to ours. I don't know because I don't have any data points to kind of compare us to, since we don't know any alien species or something like that. It seems possible, at least, that something of the sort you're saying. But maybe I can resolve this by saying I can grant that the cognitive biases are due to evolution too. Like I can grant that the cognitive biases are a way to kind of sometimes maybe a good heuristics for survival. But there's something deeper that there's something deeper than these heuristics, and these are like the first principles that we're governed by. I don't know. So if I can ask you a question, so why do you think we descriptively think about classical logic as being in some way special with respect to the other logics?
I don't think it is. So I mean, I don't think that way, and I don't think that I think there's lots of people who don't think that way. It seems to me, if I had to give an account of like why classical logic became, dominant in like the Western tradition, because I don't think it is dominant in other traditions. So I mean, look, there's a few things going on with this. There's what we might call like, our, let's call it like natural rationality, right? Just our natural way of drawing inferences, and I don't think that operates in accordance with any particular formal theory. There are different ways that we can formalize this, and usually, when we sort of give formal theories, there's an attempt to sort of. I don't know if like I would say that we're even trying to kind of, or at least everybody's even trying to kind of capture like natural rationality, because again it seems to me that that what we think of as like natural rationality often is not particularly truth tracking, right?
So can I ask you?
Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble. I don't think that I answered that question very well.
Oh no, no worries, no worries. You can always ramble again once I ask you. No, I ask you this question. So let me just open a little parenthesis and say that my STEM brain might be too dumb to grasp some of the philosophy that's going on in this conversation. and then I'll close this parenthesis. So let me ask you, this question. So it seems to me that you said that if we were to take children right now, and if we were to teach them another kind of logic, not the classical one, they would readily grow to think of the other logic we're teaching them as being the, let's say, right logic to form arguments and to. So if we were to teach them a paraconsistent logic, would they grow up? Would it be natural? Would they just naturally kind of accept it and work with it, and or would I think so. Okay. So this is the heart, I think, of where we're disagreeing, because I don't think so. So I looked at some papers regarding.
But wait, so I mean, there are whole like traditions which seem to operate with like paraconsistent logics, for example. Like it's much more prevalent in, at least as I understand it. I mean, I could be wrong about this, of course, but like in Eastern traditions, their like way of thinking is sort of more tolerant of contradictions, and so they've developed, like if you were to kind of formalize it, you'd have something like a paraconsistent logic.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think even in our Western tradition, we hold the kind of contradictory beliefs when it comes to especially things in the religious sphere. So maybe we say God is both his son and himself. So we have these kind of contradictions even in the Western tradition. But the only paper I could see, there's only really one paper that I've found, at least, that investigates, because of course what you're bringing up, I think, is very important, and I thought about it, so I wanted to investigate it, and I found only one paper talking about the law of non-contradiction, and they did one paper who did a study on the law of non-contradiction, if I'm recalling this right, and it was a cross-cultural study, and what they discovered was that they gave preliminary evidence that it seems like we all abide by this law of non-contradiction. I'm not so
subconsciously, because I mean, again, I don't. Like I literally don't even consciously.
Yeah.
So.
No. We all descriptively abide by it when in conversations or.
Yeah, that's a puzzling one though, because I think that you can. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the paper is, but like when you say that people descriptively abide by it, I completely agree. Like I think that you can give like an account of people's behavior in entirely sort of classical logical terms. And I think you can do that in entirely paraconsistent logical terms. Like there are different ways of representing people's behavior, and so I'm not sure what it means to say like people descriptively. I actually think it's absolutely true that we could, give a description of people as kind of following the law of non-contradiction. And I think we could give an alternative description that's probably just as good, where, at least sometimes they don't.
Yeah, so now I would have to, of course, recall the details of the study, but of course I can't. So let me ask you another question. So do you think we humans are kind of a tabula rasa when it comes to, say, logical domain?
No.
At least.
No, I like I said, when I mentioned, I think there's a sort of natural rationality, and presumably that's going to be influenced by, like our evolutionary history, and it's a mixture. I mean, there's it's culture and biology play an important role in making us who we are. So,
Okay, so maybe without getting fixated on the law of non-contradiction, maybe coherence, maybe being coherent is something that we all maybe as humans seem to value, maybe because our languages kind of have to obey these coherent structures or something like that.
So yeah, okay. I mean, this maybe is a slight tangent from this, but it's just something that's kind of bugging me throughout this conversation, which is
Oh yeah,
right.
go
So
forward.
let's just say that let's just say that I grant that like everybody has this architecture of classical logic, um, but then what if like it seems like even if that's the case, right? I can then sort of sit down and like reason about things, and I might then come to the conclusion that that there are some true contradictions, and then I might think, oh well, if there are some true contradictions, that means I should accept a paraconsistent logic instead. So like, even if I agree with this biological claim or sort of psychological claim about the sort of natural constitution of the human mind, right? I might still reject it, and like I think that this is I don't know that still seems to me to be like a big gap between like of course I could give a theory about the sort of rules that are subconsciously accepted by human beings,
Mhm.
but I mean I don't know I still am not seeing like how I'm getting any sort of
No,
norm or
okay.
ought from that. Like that just I mean, it's like yeah, that just seems like a description of okay, this is the
Yeah,
way human brains work, and
yeah,
like all
yeah.
right,
That's where the yeah. No, I understand the point. That's where the reforming definition would come in. But first, let me say something that I think is important right now. That I would say that classical logic or statistics are just our best effort, like our best effort to get to these principles. So, for example, Dilithiists. So when you were describing what you were doing, it's another way to me of saying, okay, so maybe classical logic isn't the best way of describing being. I'm just fully. I would fully grant that maybe classical logic isn't the best way to map onto these principles we have. Maybe it's some kind of other logic. Maybe the Dilithiists are bringing this up right now. But I would just appeal to the fact that there is this structure, and that we can self-reflectingly map onto this structure. And okay, so at this point, so where do we get the oughts? I would just say that if there are these structures that necessarily compel us to value certain things, we when we talk about so for instance, when we say you've made a logical error, so if you contradict yourself, I would say you're wrong. And I think we're using wrong in the moral sense in the same way we would be using it in the logical sphere. So if I see you, for instance, self-harming yourself, I would say that's wrong. And what I'm saying is I'm mapping onto the structure that exists in the logical, inferential, and moral domain.
yeah, okay,
So one of the reasons why I don't like this view is because it kind of smells like. So first of all, why I don't like it as I don't feel like I like it is because one of the reasons is that it kind of feels a bit akin to determinism in some ways. It's not fully deterministical, but it's just saying that our morality is already set in stone for us, and we're just kind of searching for it in these processes, and this is very unsatisfactory to me, to be honest. Actually, this hasn't got anything to do with the discussion. So yeah, so maybe I'll just let you
well
respond.
it does. I mean, you're explaining why you don't like the view, so I guess that does have something to do with it. But
I don't feel like I
I mean,
don't. Yeah,
yeah,
my
okay.
feelings
So
towards you.
it's
Yeah.
so to me it seems like all right. You're trying to give a theory of the sort of subconscious architecture of the human mind. Cool. You know, I don't
Yeah.
have any
Okay.
objections to that.
Okay. So the ulterior claim would be that if we redefine good as what we necessarily think is good according to this architecture, then we would be then this would be good enough for how we use these terms. It actually would improve their explanatory power, and it would kind of clarify what we're doing when we're using oughts and goodness. And so there would be an ulterior claim here that is way more ambitious, and and has some probably, and it can be attacked, I imagine, in various different ways.
I mean, I think so. I think that ambitious claim is, I don't know, that seems deeply implausible. I mean, it might be true. So, you know, the idea that like we're going to have anything like a sort of substantive moral theory built into this subconscious architecture, that's right. I don't think that's true. I think that you're going to get at best very vague sort of, you know, it'll be stuff like, you know, it might not even be a moral theory. It might be like in some sense like no, it probably is. It probably would be a moral theory because humans, you know, kind of evolved to be a sort of social species, obviously. So, you know, we evolved for like peace and cooperation, or at least to kind of cooperate with others to at least some extent. So we've probably got, in the sort of subconscious architecture, if there is such a thing, then it seems plausible that maybe there are like general rules that evolved, like, you know, unnecessary suffering is bad, you know, cooperate with other people, etc. I mean, even that is difficult though, you know, like, so this, interestingly, the context where I've read most about this is actually in the context of anti-realist attacks on realism, because it comes up in the evolutionary debunking argument. You know, like, very often anti-realists will sort of say, you know, we can account for our evaluative attitudes. The evaluative attitudes that we have, they didn't evolve to be tracking any kind of independent truth. They evolved in order to promote peace and cooperation, or something along those lines, right? Or rather, they evolved to promote survival and reproduction. And, you know, because humans are social species, cooperating helps to promote survival and reproduction. And, you know, but the thing is, it's like, it's not, I mean, like the empirical evidence on like exactly what evolved is it seems to me that it's unlikely that there's anything approaching like a substantive moral theory. But if there is, okay, then I think that what you're doing is, you know, you're giving a theory of our subconscious architecture, and if you want to use moral terms to refer to that, then you can. I mean, there's nothing there that's I don't have anything there to object to. I mean, you can do that. I don't think that that's what most people are doing, and it's not what I'm going to do. But if you want to do that, then go ahead.
Oh no, okay, that's okay. Okay, so so in a sense, what I'm doing. Well, I don't know if I'm actually doing this, but it kind of seems to me that I'm turning the evolutionary debunking argument a bit on itself. So I think it's misguided to think about these other oughts. Like, I don't understand even what these other oughts, or this other idea of goodness could be that is outside of us. I don't understand where it could come from. So again, this would be Mackie's queerness argument. I don't know how we could reach it. I don't know where we could ever find it. So in a sense, my reformist definition is coming closer to the anti-realist. I think I would agree with you, and I would be willing to accept that. But so I just would reject that we should be looking for these other oughts or this other goodness. I don't actually think this is. I'm not sure. That's to be honest. I'm not sure if this is what we're actually doing when we're thinking about goodness and ought claims. I don't think we're appealing to this other. Well, maybe sometimes, but I don't know. I'm not sure because I think you gave a good example of this, for instance, on Twitter. If we had this machine that would identify these mind-independent moral truths for us. And it would say, for instance, torturing babies is the right thing. You should just go right along and do it. I think this is not what we're doing when we think about morality. We are simply trying to map on to some descriptive principles that guide us. And yeah, so that's what I would say. That's what I would say to that, I guess. But maybe I would say another thing to the anti-realist. So I would say another thing to the anti-realist is that it seems to me that when we define ought and good, we're trying to clarify the use of these words in natural language. So why wouldn't an anti-realist accept this kind of identification with these words used to map on to these processes that bind us?
I don't think that's what people are doing when they use moral language. I don't think. I mean, in fact, I think we often do discover that we have certain subconscious inclinations which we just think are really bad, right? People will often be like, no, that, it sucks. So like, it seems like tribalism, for example, seems to be something that we like. That's like part of our subconscious architecture. We evolved for that. I mean, that just manifests itself all the time in people's behavior. And yet a lot of people will look at that and say, that really sucks. And so if like the moral, if you're going to come up with a moral theory that's trying to map onto these sort of moral norms that we evolved to have, I suspect, I mean, I could be wrong, I suspect a lot of people would just say that's irrelevant to what they are trying to do. In fact, I think a lot of people would see morality as explicitly about trying to kind of overcome our genes, like overcome our, biological inclinations, and we're trying to make ourselves into something better, and because we have the ability to engage in like reflection, and we can, we're not sort of creatures that just act on our impulses, and we can actually stop and think about our impulses, and we can think about the sort of rules that we want to accept, and we can engage in reasoning and all of that. Well, hey, that's what we can do to overcome all of the ways in which biology has made us, flawed and small-minded and so on.
Yeah, we want to transcend ourselves as usual. This is something we often, as humanity, we like to engage in this. But okay, so I in a sense, I would agree with what you just said, but I would see it in a different way, because if we take the classical laws of logic, I would say that they're mapping. Of course, we disagree about this, but I would say that they're mapping onto this kind of cognitive architecture we have, and then, of course, we have developed even biases. But through maybe the use of reason, through self-reflection, we can kind of weed out the biases from the underlying principles, and the same. So I would parallel this with the moral domain. So we can maybe through self-reflection, we can kind of find these self-evident principles, and then we can weed out the other evolutionary biases, but they are still part of the evolutionary baggage. But we recognize them as imperfections, or as ways in which the architecture is going wrong, because we make mistakes. We're not perfect beings, and so I would.
But then in what sense are you mapping, like, in what sense are you mapping the subconscious architecture then? Like, because if you're just going to say, well, because it sounds like what you're saying is just, well, whatever we happen to come to as being the best theory, so whatever we end up choosing as the best moral theory, like, well, that maps the sort of deep or like real subconscious architecture, and then all of this other stuff, all of these other subconscious processes that influence people's evaluative attitudes and behavior, that's like the deviant stuff, that stuff is like an influence that we can, put aside. But it seems like that judgment, the judgment that this is the real architecture and this is the deviant stuff, that's just coming from whatever moral theory you happen to accept. Like so it's not like you have a theory, like an independent theory of the subconscious architecture, and then the moral theory is just tracking that. You need the moral theory to tell you what counts as the real architecture.
So I'm not so just to maybe conclude where I would be going with these self-evident moral principles, let's say, in what sense are they self-evident? In the sense that they map onto the deepest parts of our architecture. And I would then go ahead to say that Sidgwick, in the method of ethics, is probably the person that did the best job at mapping onto these. But okay, so this is irrelevant anyway to what you just said. I feel like you're kind of asking me a lot, because you're asking me to. So maybe my view is just wrong. Maybe my view is just descriptively wrong. But you're kind of asking me. So in my view, these laws of logic are mapping onto our cognitive architecture, and you would be asking me to say, well, why have we chosen these laws, and why have we excluded these biases? And I think the logical biases from the laws of classical logic, why have we made this?
I was actually asking specifically about morality in that case, rather than, just to clarify.
Yeah, but I would.
So, and the reason is because.
Okay, so would you grant that in the realm of logic we are able to kind of see logical biases and see logical principles?
I mean,
you don't
for the purpose of the conversation, yes, and I think that there's the reason why I was focusing specifically on morality there is because I think that there probably is a lot more variation in moral attitudes than in the case of logic. So I wasn't really making a point about logic there. It was just like specifically in the moral case, because I don't know, with the logical case, it's like that seemed plausible, and I think I mentioned that, I think I mentioned earlier that, like, yeah, that's plausible. It seems just totally implausible when it comes to morality to me. Like on this point, I don't know, I don't think I am even willing to kind of grant it, because I don't even see this as being like the idea that we're going to get a substantive moral theory by like describing the subconscious architecture of the human mind. That seems, I don't know, I like that seems
totally absurd.
Yeah, like I just don't accept that.
Okay. No, that's fine. So to me instead, I don't know why, but to me instead, so if I, for example, take the principles of Sidgwick and that basically spell out a kind of utilitarian consequentialist moral theory, it seems to me that I can, and this is going to be a very bold claim I'm about to make, it seems to me that I can kind of capture, I don't know, 95% of the way humans have historically and cross-culturally behaved when creating their moral norms.
Really?
Yeah.
95%.
So this, yeah. So no. So okay. So
95% utilitarian.
Yeah. So okay. So okay, this prima facie. This seems very ambitious. But let me just say that. So these first principles, of course, when I say that we can capture, okay, so maybe I would go back on what I just said. You made me reflect a bit. No. So of course, when I think about principles of logic or principles of statistics that guide us, of course, we kind of stochastically obey them. As you were saying before, even for the laws of logic, we make mistakes. We can be in self-contradiction with one another. We can be incoherent. For the laws of statistics, we can make mistaken inferences. So we can make mistakes, even, for example, if you grant the fact that these laws of logic kind of govern our structure, we can still make mistakes descriptively while using them. So in the same sense, if we grant these principles that Sidgwick lays out, it wouldn't be that we're perfectly matching on to a utilitarian normative theory. We of course we would be making mistakes. Then, as in the case of the statistics or the laws of logic, there would be biases in this domain too. So we will be brought to apply things in a way that don't that are wrong. And of course, I'm paralleling from the laws of logic. So it's not that it's a perfect one-to-one match. But if we look at the rules that govern different societies through time, and I don't know, the arguments for moral convergence, it seems to me that we are getting closer and closer to this kind of utilitarianism.
Yeah, I think that the moral convergence arguments are really poor. There are so many other ways of accounting for convergence, and it's like we live in a world which is increasingly kind of globalized. People are like mixing together. Obviously there's going to be convergence, but like if we are talking about the kind of architecture that has been kind of instilled in us subconsciously, well, I mean, I like I say, the empirical evidence on this is unclear at the moment, but it looks like there's a very strong case for some sort of like tribal preference, let's say, like in-group preference to have been just built into us, right? So I mean, that's not utilitarian. And not only is there a strong case that that's been built into us, that seems to have manifested itself throughout pretty much every society all in human history. And that doesn't seem to be utilitarian.
So I agree. So I have two things to say about that. So the first is that as you were claiming before in our conversation, there's some evolutionary, what we would call biases, even in the...
Yeah, but wait, no. You don't get to call it a bias, because your claim is that the moral theory is supposed to be tracking our subconscious architecture, right? So it's like why is that a bias? Right? Why isn't that just part of the architecture that our moral theory should be tracking?
Well, okay, so I'm again would go back to the logical domain. So
no. Let's not go back. No, right? Okay, I can grant. Like, let's just grant that classical logic. I'll just grant that. Let's stick with this moral point. Like, I don't see how.
But you grant that there are biases in the logical domain that we are evolutionary brought to.
I think that here's what I might be able to. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't grant that, but I just want to stick to, like, I don't understand how you're going to claim that, like, in-group preference has not evolved I guess you want to say it has evolved.
No, it has evolved, yeah.
Right, so it has evolved. So, like, how is that not part of the subconscious architect?
Because not everything, because it's... Yeah, this is the argument we keep getting stuck up on, and I recognize that it's hard to me to spell out where the limits of a theory, the principles of a theory, map onto us, and where they and where instead there's biases. So maybe one way to say descriptively, I think there's a bias, is that we can see that today, descriptively at least, these tribalism has seemed to be always been expanding. So it would be, so if this was really a principle that was deeply instilled in us, and that was one of the principles we should account for. It seems strange that today in our world people are even thinking about expanding the tribal circle even to sentient beings. It just seems descriptively that if this was a constant, why is these circles kind of expanding through time?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it is a constant, because I mean, people are influenced by culture as well. I wouldn't say that I don't think any moral principles are constants in that sense. I mean, but Yeah, I think that you can account for convergence in sort of purely, let's say, sociological terms. Like there, you can look at the sort of changes that have occurred. I mean, if you imagine like two societies that are both in both completely separate, right? And maybe they have like different normative views, and then they start meeting each other, they start interacting, and they start like sharing food and cultural products, and they start sort of reasoning together. You would expect there to be a convergence in their moral views regardless of what's going on in terms of like the subconscious architecture, or regardless of what the moral facts are or anything like that. That's just a product of like the fact that they're interacting and interacting with each other. And so I think that the same kind of explanation will apply to the apparent convergence that we see. I'm also kind of skeptical that there is really that much. I think sometimes people overstate the extent of convergence that has actually occurred. I do wonder if like we live currently in a sort of liberal democracy where those sorts of utilitarian values are fairly strongly held. I mean, there's a lot of people who just who reject utilitarianism as a moral theory, but like I agree that we often evaluate things in terms of like promotion of like we care about like reducing suffering and promoting pleasure and that. So I guess you can see them as like broadly utilitarian values. But I don't know. I mean, I can imagine the sort of world order changing. I can imagine a future where I don't know, China becomes much more powerful, and maybe our moral thinking goes in a very different way. Like I can see a future where liberal democracies decline in their power, and I imagine that the sort of moral theories that people accept would change as well. But maybe that's kind of beside the point, because
Okay,
I don't know,
so
I can't predict the future.
no, okay.
But
So maybe let me say another thing about tribalism. So tribalism, in a way, can be seen even as a utilitarian tendency. So, for instance, if we go back 2,000, 3,000 years, and we meet another tribe, we don't know which laws govern them. We don't know if they're going to be more, if they're going to be aggressive. We don't know. So yeah, just kind of piggybacking on what you were saying. It seems like utilitarian principles, if we bring them back in time, there's a different environment that so which they would kind of map onto the descriptive ways that tribes formed a bit better, because these tribes are like saying, okay, we should care about these other tribes that are near us, but maybe we have limited resources, we have to make difficult decisions. Maybe this tribe, maybe we don't have resources to feed both groups, and so then utilitarian principles would kind of avow some tribalism, in a sense that I have good reason to think that my tribe has the better rules, the better norms than the next tribe, and because there's not enough resources for both, I have to do what's best for the overall good. And I don't even know how many members are in the other tribe, so maybe I should kind of yeah.
yeah,
So
I don't think that kind of thing really helps here, because you're sort of like I mean, in a way, it's like kind of applying the utilitarian reasoning at sort of a higher level, right? So where it's kind of saying, well, like, the sort of tribes that acted like the kind of tribes that like acted without this sort of in-group preference, well, they would end up sort of being less successful, right? Because maybe they would encounter violent tribes or whatever, or maybe they'd be exploited or something like that. I mean, and that may well be true, but that's not going to explain the cognitive architecture that humans actually evolved with. In the kind of environment that you're describing, what we would expect is that the cognitive architecture that humans evolved with is one that has in-group preference built into it. because in-group preference is what promotes survival and reproduction. And I think that's it
Hmm.
seems pretty plausible that that's how humans did evolve, because it seems pretty plausible that that is the kind of environment that people evolved in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just wanted to say I can see you're making a strong point here because I really can't disagree that evolutionary history. Um, it seems that survival we should in kind of have some in-group preferences. It seems very plausible and compelling. Uh, so yeah, okay. So yeah, I won't go back to the bias argument because um,
Well, I mean, it may be
no,
worth
okay.
exploring. I mean, like, I don't want to put you off it, you know. Um,
No, it's just that I don't feel I'm equipped to really make any better argument right now towards that because you do make some good points about it, and I'm going to think about it better, and maybe I'll reject what I'm now holding. I maybe just need some time to recognize the points you made. Um, so yeah, so right now, of course, I can't. I would have to try. I would have to try to find a way to distinguish biases in some domains with biases with what we mean by these two things, and it kind of seems foggy to me. Um, it's something that I haven't thought of. So first of all, I'm glad you brought it up because um, you're kind of making me think about something I haven't thought of. So that's important, at least for myself. Um, yeah, but I'm not sure I could do a better job at arguing for why we have biases in yeah so for why I would think that there's evolutionary biases in some domain and why they would translate to the moral one. um yeah, that's I would say.
okay. Well, I mean, you know, I'm good to hear that there's something for you to think about. I'm glad I could help. I guess, in some
Yeah,
sense. Uh,
yeah,
yeah,
actually thank
and
you. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, thanks for inviting me. I mean, was that all you wanted to talk about then?
Yeah, no,
Okay,
I'm very happy with this. Let me just
cool.
let me just bring an objection that I thought you were going to bring but you didn't, that I think is quite strong actually to what I'm saying, and it's the Zorpian example, the alien example, and this would be an argument for moral disagreement. Um, so, according to my view, let's say there was an alien race that developed evolutionarily in a very different way than us, and it came to Earth, and they were mapping onto these other moral, this other cognitive architecture for morality. Um, it doesn't seem like we could resolve this disagreement. It, given my definition of morality, of my naturalist definition, it doesn't seem we could resolve the disagreement in any way. And yeah, of course, now I have to answer my own question because you're not going to help me answer it. So no, I just felt that this was another objection that uh, I kind of see the strength to. I'm not sure if the other alien race could exist. So maybe there could be an argument where we say that it's just that every organism capable of self-reasoning or self-reflection um, develops in the same way regarding these moral principles. So this disagreement just doesn't occur. What would you say to that?
I mean, you can postulate that if you want. I don't see any reason to believe it, but okay. I yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no,
I
but
just I don't know
so,
how to evaluate that, because like
okay,
we
so
only really
maybe
have one example of organisms that have like developed the ability to reflect, right? So we would have to have other examples in order to start making claims about like how, like what are the principles that like govern the evolution of kind of self-reflective consciousness.
Yeah, so maybe let me argue for what I just said a bit. So um, all the other organisms um, we see, of course, they're not capable of self-reflection like us. But it does seem like there is some structural value in them, at least. So, for example, a dog values, I don't know, food. He values reproduction, and uh, if we were to give the ability, and all organisms that kind of organisms seem to develop in a way that at a certain point they experience suffering, so they can experience suffering at a certain point. And this is a point where it seems like it gets us closer to self-reflection. And I don't know, like, of course, this is no proof of anything, but if I were to give self-reflection to, let's say, a dog, it seems to me that he might map onto principles that maybe we care of too. So maybe one that I was talking about before is like unnecessary suffering is bad. It seems like he might agree that unnecessary suffering is bad, even if he can't arrive there yet because he's not a self-reflection creature.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure then. So would this be an expression of what you take its subconscious beliefs to be? Like when we're imagining giving it reflection. So the idea
Yeah,
is
you
that
can.
that's the unnecessary suffering is bad is built into the subconscious architecture, and then that influences its conscious beliefs.
Yeah. So
Right.
of course, I don't kind of. I'm kind of iffy on the subconscious word, so I would say subconscious, conscious. Okay, but you acknowledge that. Yeah. So yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is because that like there's another way of like running this, which is, well, like once you have reflective consciousness, you can kind of start getting certain like moral facts from that. But yeah, it didn't seem like that was the kind of line that was the kind of view you were making there. Yeah, I mean, look, it seems to me that when I look at different species, I would expect their evaluative attitudes to be radically different from ours. Now, there's a sort of way of accounting for that within the sort of framework of like universal moral principles, where we can say, well, it's because those species have, it's because those species like live in different circumstances and they have different, like literally different biological constitutions. Obviously in a species where the means of reproduction is completely different. There's the distinction between like R strategists and K strategists. So it turns out like humans have to invest a lot of time into raising their young, whereas in other species that's not the case. Like rabbits don't have to do that because they just produce so many young. So given these different biological constitutions, the same universal moral principles might end up producing different, what seem to be different moral views. So I mean, you can always kind of make that sort of argument, but then I would have thought that if we're talking about the sort of the subconscious architecture, the sort of evaluative attitudes that species have evolved with, I would have thought there would just be a difference there. But I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic on this sort of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So no, nothing. So thank you for entertaining me and for making me think. And love your YouTube videos and everything. And yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to have this conversation.